Right, welcome everyone to the next hearing, which is hearing 16 on light. Commence the hearing by noting that we've got presentations by RWLR, or known as the Carter Group, Synlait Milk, and also Castle Hill Community Association Incorporated. We've also got tabled letters and evidence from Horticulture New Zealand, Orion NZ, Fonterra and Midland Port, which we will duly consider as part of the deliberations. We've got the benefit of a Section 42A report from Ms. Vicky Barker, who's sitting in the room here today. She has also provided answers to panel's questions prior to the hearing, which are posted on the website. And at the culmination of the hearing, we'll ask for a reply report from the officer and give her a steer as best we can on any particular matters we'd like covered in that. All right. Now the first presenter is going to be the Carter Group, and if you just please introduce yourselves again, that would be useful. We have a different panel member.
So, hello, my name is Ms. Forrester. I'm counsel for the various Carter Group companies appearing today. Now, we didn't lodge any legal submissions in relation to this topic either, but I'm here to assist Ms. Clark and answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you for that. Ms. Clark, you've handed out a summary statement today, so thank you for that, and we'll ask you to present that.
Welcome. My name is Amy Clark. I'm a planner practicing with Novo Group Limited in Christchurch. I have 5 years' experience as a resource management planner within Territorial Authority, and I have recently moved into consulting. I summarise my main points beginning at paragraph 6 below, noting that with the exception of those matters below, the substance of the provisions proposed by the officer are supported almost entirely by the submitters, and based on the assessment in the Section 42A report, they are appropriate in my view, but the further amendments are necessary to ensure provisions are the most appropriate, efficient and effective way of achieving the objectives in accordance with Section 32B of the Act. So beginning at the light overview, notes that the provisions for artificial outdoor lighting provide for adequate lighting to support activities and enable safety and security while minimising potential adverse effects. To maintain consistency with the evidence on policies P1 and P3, this should instead read as the provisions for outdoor lighting provide for adequate lighting to support activities and enable safety and security while avoiding significant and remedying or mitigating other potential adverse effects. However, this is a minor matter. It's not something I'm particularly insistent on, given that the overview isn't as directive as the objectives and policies. Light P1 and light P3 seek to minimise adverse effects. Minimise by definition requires to reduce something especially bad to the lowest possible level, which may not be necessary, practicable, achievable or desirable in some instances. Accordingly, these policies should instead seek to avoid and remedy or mitigate other adverse effects, noting that this would not detract from the provisions. So I recommend that the following amendments are made. Light P1, the phrase manage new artificial outdoor light to minimise light spill and glare onto adjoining sites and glare onto roads to provide for the health and safety of people and the safe and efficient operation of the land transport network should be amended to read manage new artificial outdoor lighting to avoid significant and remedy or mitigate other light spill and glare onto adjoining sites and glare onto roads to provide for the health and safety of people and the safe and efficient operation of the land transport network. And light P3 should reads the phrase minimise potential upward light that causes sky glow by controlling new artificial outdoor lighting. That should be amended to read avoid significant and remedy or mitigate other potential upward light that causes sky glow by controlling new artificial outdoor lighting. 2. Light REQ1, it provides for maximum light spills onto adjoining sites, and its proposed wording requires compliance to be determined at the site boundary rather than a notional boundary or another specified distance. I recommend that the GRUZ column of Table 1 is amended to specify that for this measurement, this is to be taken within a line 20 metres from any side of a residential unit or other building used for a sensitive activity, or the legal boundary where this is closer to such a building, to better reflect the point of effect rather than at the site boundary where there may be no effect. So that I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that. I think what we'll do is, as before, we'll split any questioning into the policy part and then the rule part. So if any if any commissioners have questions on relation to the policy matters, starting with Commissioner Alexander, who's just joined us. Nothing on that. Okay. Raven?
I'm looking at your paragraph 11 in your evidence in chief, but it also refers to paragraph 7 in your evidence presented today. Just a point of clarification, can you provide an example of where minimising adverse effects of lighting may be necessary, practicable, achievable, or desirable?
So let me just... We're minimising, so reducing to the lowest possible level. I would say in terms of the light spill onto sites where there is no effect, if you're minimising that to the lowest possible level, that might not be necessary where there isn't an area of effect on the neighbouring site. So I think minimise indicates that that should be reduced to the lowest possible level, but it may not be necessary where there isn't any neighbouring effect.
So nobody would be affected by that in that instance.
Mm.
Okay, great, thank you.
Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just probably an observation rather than a question, but I think the wording, as the Chair pointed out under earthworks, your proposed wording uses the word avoid and remedy and mitigate other adverse effects. And I just had a quick scroll through, and none of the rules trigger or default to non-complying from what I can see. My quick scan, they all look like they go to restricted discretionary.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so it's just a question around whether that policy wording can be sustained by the rules that implement it or not.
Okay. It's similar.
Yeah, and I don't know.
Need to look into that one.
Would put you on the spot now, but whether the Chair wants to provide you with an opportunity to reconsider that or something else.
Yes, certainly. If after the hearing you feel you'd like to put another word to us, that's probably I think you're able to do that. If it's less than avoid, which most words will be, then we're able to consider that.
Yeah, I would like to go and have a think about that one if that's okay.
And no doubt the reporting officer will pick up on that too and respond to that as well.
Great. Thank you.
I was just wondering, the word in your paragraph 7, you've alerted us to minimise by definition means the lowest possible level, and that's what the discussion is around in the question you just answered before. It might not always be necessary to reduce the effect if it doesn't affect anyone. So just testing with you, would an alternative word be practicable, the lowest practicable level? Would that be sufficient, or do you think you still maintain the words you've suggested would be preferable?
To the lowest practicable. I guess so. I think in terms of measuring that and how that would be measured would be something to have a think about. But
it's just if you don't like that, it's fine. It's just thought I'd put that through because I certainly understand the point you're making. That's the key thing. You're making that point quite well. So thank you for that. It's interesting, the light policies 1 and 3 don't actually use the word adverse effects, do they? And what you're suggesting is we introduce words that do bring those words in, if I've got it right. Well, what you've suggested in light P3 should be amended to read avoid significant and remedy or mitigate other potential upward light that causes sky glow. So it doesn't actually use the word effect, sorry. So you're avoiding significant and remedying and mitigating light and sky glow, but it's not associated with the word effects, which is a bit unusual, but it's just an observation again. Yeah. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but if you think that's, if you're satisfied that's something you'd like to put to us, that's fine. But anyway, I think this is different to the earthworks policies, which do use the words effects.
Yeah, it is a little bit.
These ones don't, but I think the point you're making is they describe effects, even if they don't use the word. Is that right? Okay. All right. Now, look, thank you for that. I've got no further questions on the policy side of it. So we'll just see if there's any questions on light REQ1, and start with Mark again. Right. No. Andrew, this is the notional boundary.
Yeah, I do have a question. So, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate you put it within the context of the approach with noise as well in terms of notional boundary. But my question is, you've talked about there being no effect to others if there's no sensitive activity or sensitive building nearby. So why is it then taken at the boundary? And I guess I'm interested in your views on what would happen in the future if the adjoining block was developed and a light sensitive activity was proposed closer to the boundary than the existing building. And should it be stopped because of the existing light spill from the neighbouring activity? Is that your expectation, or would it be simply existing use rights that would apply next door now, or would the neighbouring activity that's causing the light spill then have to change their activities because of the fact that the development next door is now evolved, developed, changed, or whatever?
Well, I guess I wouldn't expect that then existing activity would have to then stop based on the change of activity next door. I guess it's establishing that existing environment where there is that light spill. If they've established it as permitted, then that activity is there. And if the use changes next door, I guess there is that level of effect, but that's existing, and be aware of that. Would be my understanding.
It's a difficult issue, isn't it? Because it goes to the heart of property rights and that sort of thing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But look, I mean, you've answered my question. Thank you. That's okay.
Well, just on that, the 20 metre notional boundary setback. Do you know what the setback for buildings is in the rural zone? Is it 20 metres by chance, or can someone help me with that?
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Look that up, but yeah, I guess I was interested. It was a similar question to Commissioner Willis, that if we went with that definition for notional boundary, you could potentially get maybe a dwelling built within 20 metres of the boundary, which would then become, which should then be obviously closer to the light source than what the notional boundary provides. But if there's a 50 metre or 20 metre setback in the rural zone, that might be relevant to our considerations.
Yeah, that should be.
It's a 5 metre setback for internal boundaries.
5 metres.
Yeah.
Okay.
Further questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next submitter we had down was Castle Hill Community Associations. Gentleman from that organisation, thank you. Come forward. Welcome along, sir. And if you could just please introduce yourself.
My name is Rick Hill. I'm a long-time committee member of the Castle Hill Community Association. The Community Association represents about 100 of the section owners up there. There's about 140 houses there now. There has been for some time disquiet about the lighting conditions in the village. And there is a desire to see a provision for more dark sky in the whole Craigieburn Valley. We're very privileged to live in a place like Castle Hill Village with the spectacular natural landscape all around it. I first built a house there some nearly 30 years ago, and there's been a significant degradation in what you can see in the sky, not least that caused by the latest round of LED streetlights that were installed. However, what is of concern is that we have provisions for light spill affecting spilling onto the rural area around, but there's also the reserves within the village and other spaces where you can go and look at the night sky. And if we don't take some action to protect those areas and other areas, then we will just, within the village, you won't be able to see anything. So you'll end up having to cross the state highway or go onto the dock estate to be able to take advantage of the night sky. So we'd like to see some restrictions within the village as to the amount of light spill that can occur. Now, I'm no expert on the topic, but it seems to me that having just ordinary residential lighter rules there is not appropriate in a special area like Castle Hill Village. And that's really the extent of our submission.
So is there any particular part of the proposed plan provisions on light that interest you?
The light table at REQ1 just talks about adjoining spill, maximum light spill from artificial outdoor lighting onto the rural zone, but makes no reference to light spill from one section to another within the general residential zone that is Castle Hill Village.
Yes, I do. I didn't, but I'm just picked up on something you talked about the degradation of the area due to street lighting.
Yes.
So
the government provided funding for new LED lights. Because of the nature of the lampposts, these spill significantly onto other residential properties to the extent of number of these lights in right-of-ways now been removed or permanently disabled, and the fittings themselves that the council installed are unsuitable for the environment.
So it's not that you're opposed to street lighting as such?
No, it's not street.
How or the message, this light spill?
It's the question of light spill that is the issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your submission. In her report, the officer has basically accepted your submission that you be included as in the same zone, in the same requirements as the general rural zone. Does that meet your the outcome that you're requesting? You're not seeking anything further than that?
Although I have the handbook on dark sky, it's quite a time to wade through.
Yeah.
And it seems that in terms of what was proposed what's suggested in the proposed district plan, that would be the best outcome that fits with the way the plan is currently drafted.
So the recommended amendment is to include the Castle here effectively as part of the rural zone for lighting.
Yes.
And that would meet your requirements.
Yes.
Thank you.
That was my question. No further question.
No further. That's well presented. It's very clear and understood, and the officer has supported you. So thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you. All right. We'll now hear from Synlait, Mr. Chapman. I've dealt with you just recently, haven't I, Mr. Chapman? Yeah. Welcome along to the hearing.
I'm going to take you down the road, State Highway 1, to the Synlait site, to the DPZ zone, which is what we wish to address you on this morning. I haven't filed any legal submissions, but I've got 5 points that I want to make just by way of introduction to this light chapter. Firstly, I think it's fair to say that Synlait is not opposed to the aspirations of the council in protecting the night sky in the Selwyn district. But in the first point that I'm going to make, in the processing setting, in a manufacturing setting, the issue of lighting will, in my submission, be driven by the Health and Safety at Work Act. Irrespective of the provisions of this plan, probably that is the most critical part for Synlait's operation, to ensure the health and safety of its employees. And really, I think that's the driver for our submission on this plan this morning. We would like to ideally see the plan dovetail into what Synlait considers its requirements for health and safety of its employees on site. And if, in my submission, if the plan stays the way it is, it won't be adequate from Synlait's point of view to say we can live with the plan and we'll design to what the plan prescribes for the Synlait site. It will, in my view, set up a procedural step for compliance just to make sure that Synlait is at all times ensuring that a 24/7 site for manufacturing complies with its health and safety requirements. The second point I want to make is that, just to use an analogy, I think the plan is a little bit like a teenager having a conversation. It probably knows, and we all know in the room, what the plan wants to say. It just hasn't used the right words. And the evidence of Ms. Rikers is going to address you on that point and what she regards as the difficulties with the words used in the plan. Again, I emphasise it's not a submission contrary to what I believe is the Council's aspirations in this area. The third point that I want to address you on is that Synlait, as you will know, was required to get a resource consent when it put in the rail siding. There's no option in terms of where that rail siding has to be. It has to be directly on the boundary, close to the main trunk line. It can't move it effectively to escape issues of lighting. That resource consent has been granted, obviously, and I want to just go through a little bit of the genesis of getting that resource consent. It's a Kiwi Rail operated siding, so clearly Synlait had to comply with Kiwi Rail's demands for the location and lighting of the site. But what Synlait designed the site to do was in accordance with the Victorian lighting standard, which Mr. Denicourt has attached to his evidence. Synlait did look at the Kiwi Rail requirements, but determined again, probably for health and safety reasons, that that degree of lighting was inadequate. And you may think that it's a very simple rail siding, but simply designing to Kiwi Rail specifications didn't take into account that Synlait, it's not a dedicated Kiwi Rail site. There's a lot of employees from Synlait that are moving containers around right against the rail traffic, and that's why they deferred to the Australian standard, which has higher light specifications. And I just simply say to you that I think that Australian standard is targeted. When Mr. Muir in his evidence refers to the standard, it's not a targeted standard relating to lighting standards. And so, in my view, Synlait did the right thing to find some targeting lighting standards. And after all, I'm not really sure whether a rail siding is that different, whether it's in Australia or New Zealand. So that's why Synlait adopted the criteria for lighting, because of the interrelationship between offloading and loading of the Synlait personnel and the Kiwi Rail personnel at the site. My fourth point is that, and it might seem pernickety, but I think that on a close reading of Mr. Muir's evidence, and I'm referring particularly to his commentary at paragraph 5.4 and the table that he sets out detailing the various lighting zones at 5.5, and notably when he gets to look at the high lighting zones, as they're called, high district brightness zones, he doesn't encompass manufacturing. In fact, manufacturing and processing really isn't addressed, in my view, adequately in that table at all. But if you then go on in his evidence at paragraph 6.15, he sneaks in industrial when he is then defining what he regards as a high district brightness in the zone. And in my view, that high district brightness is entirely appropriate for the Synlait operations. So just the last fifth point, what are we coming to you for this morning? Firstly, Ms. Rikers, I believe, has provided the wording to you where the policies associated with lighting can be more directive and encouraging of enabling Synlait's operations for a work site. And secondly, Synlait want an increase in the DPZ lux levels so that they read from 5 to 10 lux rather than the 2 to 5 lux, which is in the plan as it stands. And just a commentary, I've looked at comparisons with the lighting levels afforded to the port zone in the draft. And I know that the port zone, you will tell me that the container height is different at the port zone, but I'm really questioning whether there's a major difference. Synlait does exactly the same in terms of storing containers on its site for loading and then loading them out for export. The port zone's got a 25 lux upper limit, and Synlait at present, the way the plan is presented, is at 5. And we're simply saying that it's the same movements of, what do you call them, reach stackers? Have I got that word right? It's the same movement of reach stackers around the site, which happens at the Synlait site in the same manner that it also happens at the port zone. So they're my opening comments. I'm going to firstly ask Mr. Denicourt just to introduce himself and answer any questions, but I do want, in introducing this topic, for him to just explain what's happening in a COVID situation associated with the availability of containers and how Synlait's at the beck and call of screaming for containers on its site and when those movements happen.
See if there's any questions about the legal matters you raised.
Yes, sure.
I'll just check with the panel on that. You'll come back. Raven, any questions on legal matters? Okay. Okay. I'll just ask a couple of questions.
I've got them down in my fine handwriting in summary, and I'm happy to provide those to the panel if you wish.
Oh, that would be good. I've got a couple of sort of higher level questions, I guess, and that is you alerted us to the Health and Safety Act, and I'm just, a question in my mind is does that potentially override the RMA in terms of, in other words, if the district plan levels are too low to allow safe operation, what would happen in the event that there was a breach and the Health and Safety Act supported the need for higher levels, do you think?
Well, I'm going to probably put myself on a line here. Firstly, I'm not an employment lawyer, but I'm well aware of the chit and wag around the office cooler in my office, that the fines associated with non-compliance and for health and safety, particularly for a large manufacturing operation, are sky high and are going to completely motivate Synlait if the plan is inadequate, to simply have to go, as I've said, through the motions of getting adequate lighting on their site through whatever means.
And I suspect that if there was a prosecution to bear, then the courts would be influenced by the health and safety requirements as part of their consideration. But,
yes, I think they would. I think even in a resource management context, if there was a resource management non-compliance, someone will tell you what health and safety says about it and addressing the effects on the environment.
But I think the important point you put to us was that you're seeking to dovetail the provisions to dovetail with what's reasonable under the Health and Safety Act. So thank you for that.
That's what I'd like.
And the only other question I had was in relation to, and I think you touched on it, in relation to Synlait's operation, their site. It's to what extent can it rely on existing use rights and resource consent requirements to obviate the need for, complying with new rules? Or is this more to do with expansion or new development on the site you're concerned with lighting rules?
We might all comment on this question about existing use rights. Synlait's got a resource consent for the rail siding. No questions about that. But, who knows what the level of development might be in terms of the scale and character of the activity. It just might... dare I say it, increase in size, and that's why we're coming to you. I guess from my perspective, I'm sensitive that because of the large scale of the operation, I don't really want to face a hearing where there's a technical non-compliance, a trigger method from the lighting chapter, when the driver is really about making sure that the DPZ can operate to allow and enable the expansion at that site. And it just can raise a number of submissions, of course, in relation to those operations. So I'm trying to avoid a technical issue becoming bigger than Ben-Hur in a resource consent hearing in the future, I guess.
Sorry, my final question was in relation to Ms. Riker's evidence. She's alerted us to the provisions not being enabling enough, or not delivering on the promise, if you like, to enable lighting in operations like this. Is that part of your legal submissions, that it's not strong enough in that area?
Absolutely, but I'm going to let Ms. Rikers deal with that because she knows more about that than I do. Yeah.
That's fine. Well, thank you for answering those preliminary questions, and I
think I will just
send those through. That would be useful. So
it happens to be on a Millbrook letterhead, but don't take anything from that. It's a conference that I went to.
To ask Mr. Dinacourt to
yes,
right. Thank you, Mr. Dinacourt.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Chairman and panel. I am Yves Denicourt. I am the Policy and Planning Manager for Synlait. I've been for the last 3 years. So to my evidence on 10.11, I will not discuss too much into the planning debate about the word work. I will leave that to Mrs. Riker. But I can make a general comment about the plan or the lighting chapter for the plan. It seems to have avoided or not taken into account any industrial large manufacturing site that works around the clock. And when you look at all the submission from other submitters, I think there's a common theme there that's been ignored. I will jump now to the rail siding and the description, and I'll add a bit to the description of Mr. Chapman. So the rail siding was designed and put in service in May 2021. During the detailed design, we came up with against the lighting requirement for the rail siding, or the safe operation of the rail siding, and also the safe operation of the loading, unloading. we didn't meet the 3 lux limit at which is the current limit, the 3 lux at the boundary. In this case, the boundary is the Paper Road water race to the north, straight after the property boundary. We ended up with, so KiwiRail requires 40 lux to come on site, but KiwiRail doesn't really work as such on site. They come with empty wagon and they leave with full wagon. The amount of work they're carrying is quite limited in space and time. It was clear from our engineering perspective that to work safely in that area with the reach stacker, as Mr. Chapman described, it needed a lot more lighting than that. That's where we went to the Australian standards for similar operation. I wouldn't call them Australian standard. I would call them code of practice for similar operation. That's to make sure we're not confusing with Mr. Muir's standard AS 4282. These recommend 150 lux. Even the New Zealand Food Safety Authority 2006 document recommend 150 lux for external lighting. We visited site at 40 lux, and that was considered not enough for what we intended to do. So we settled in the middle for 100 lux. And 100 lux basically at the yard stand, which is closer to the manufacturing site, and 40 lux at the rail siding to comply with KiwiRail request. That gives 16 lux at the roadside boundary and 6 lux at the rail corridor, which is next to the state highway. So we went through the resource consent process and we obtained a resource consent, but it was probably more a fluke. It's because the neighbors are across the state highway and then there was less than 3 lux. But if we wanted to develop our site along Irvine's Road or Eslerton Roads in the same way, we can't meet 3 lux. And whether Mr. Chapman talked about 5 lux, but the table right now, the table 1, the proposed table 1's got the 3 lux and the 5 lux. But we cannot dim the light at night. We're not that kind of operation. So we need to take the more stringent number, and it's 3 lux, and we can't meet 3 lux. So when Mr. Muir in his evidence state that can be done, we couldn't do it. And that's recent technology, LED light, brand new. So there's a question mark there. About when we designed the rail siding, we always wanted to dim the light if the siding was not in use or we didn't have any operation going on. And that's since the inception in May 2021, because of COVID and the logistic problem that we have, we basically, any container we have, we need to fill them and ship them. And we're dependent of KiwiRail, see a schedule of work, and works needs to happen. So the dimming of the light didn't happen as much as we would have hoped for. But it's always in the plan that if we get back into a more normal operation, we can probably dim the light at night. But it's not a...
Does that, if you do dim it, does that save significant amount of electricity? Or is it worth your while to do that? Or is
from an LED, it's a lot less, but it's definitely, there's always a power saving when you shut the light. It's so we're very dependent of the condition at the moment. Just looking at my notes here. So basically our concern is it's with our obligation to a safe workplace, as Mr. Chapman was describing. And we would have to get into resource consent pretty much everywhere we want to develop the site at the moment. It's,
I do this time. Thank you. You're asking to be considered the same as the port zone, and then you just told us that your current rail siding at the rail siding boundary is 6 lux, and at the road is 16, but neither of those would be compliant with the light spill from the port zone either, as in table 1 in the plan. Or am I misreading something? In terms of table 1 light spill adjoining site, I'm just trying to see how you know, at those lighting levels, you would appear not to be compliant with any zone at night in the district plan. Am I missing something? Perhaps Mrs. Rikers can come to that when she speaks. I'm trying to get my head around this, because unlike noise, light's not generally diminished by distance. You know, light spill is light spill, and it travels. It's not, noise diminishes over distance, but light tends to be there, whether it's immediately neighbouring or some distance away. The light spill is visible. So I'm just trying to get my head around your request to be considered similar to the port zone, but it would appear that the port zone doesn't meet that you're brighter than the port zone would be if we were to grant that request. I'm just trying to get my head around, if you understand what I'm asking. That from what you've just stated about your rail siding lighting, that you'd be brighter than any zone.
Yeah, well, maybe if I can help, if we could pose the question in a different way, and that is, how does your light compare to the port zone's light emissions? Is it comparable? Is it more or less, just in general terms?
I can't say.
Well, you haven't measured it. Okay.
I don't know.
Right. Okay.
I never worked at the port.
It's okay.
But one thing I could say is that we're not asking for 25 lux, which is the port zone. We're asking for 10. Because although we want to develop the site, I don't think there'll be another development that would be as light intensive requirement as the rail siding. So I would say that 40 lux elsewhere on site would be sufficient, which would probably meet 10 lux at the boundary. Well, if that makes sense.
I was looking at table 1 with from 2200 to 600, none of the zones have 10, they have 5 as the highest. So it's 10, 10 would be acceptable between 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, but from 10 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning, the highest proposed zone spill is 5. So I'm just trying to get my head around your request.
I think the Ms. Rikers might address that. I think the question is what you're asking in terms of the relief. It would be more than what the port zone has in the table, according to your reading of it, right? So if you wanted to respond to that, you can. Yep. Rowan, any questions on?
I do have a couple. I'm just curious about your paragraphs 17 and 18, where you discuss the light levels at the Dunsandel siding and say they are consistent with Synlay's site engineering specification standard and the Australian standard or code of practice, and that these levels comply with health and safety and food safety guidelines. You then offer 3 outcomes as a result of these light levels. And at your 18.2, and I've picked up on what Mr. Chapman said, that the whole point of Synlay's submission about light is the health and safety of its staff. At your 18.2, you talk about, you say, have not resulted in any complaints from any of our employees. It's true, isn't it, that you'd get complaints if the lighting was not bright enough, but would you get complaints if it was too bright and exceeded the permitted light level?
From a work safe perspective, I doubt that we would get complaint about too much light from our employees. That would be very doubtful. We considered going to 150 lux, but we decided that 100 lux would be more acceptable because there's another component to it is pest control. The more light, the more flying insect you attract. So that was, for us, it was we had to balance between health and safety, providing enough light for health and safety, and not creating another problem of pest control. So we wouldn't have complaint, but that's 100 lux, and we couldn't meet the 3 lux at the boundary with 100 lux. So we didn't get any complaints from the neighbors either, but because they're far, far away, there's kind of a special circumstances there because of the state highway in between.
And regarding the pest control, I presume the brighter the light, the more likely it is you'd get pests, I suppose, because light travels further.
Yeah, they fly through the lights, and flying insects are a bit of a problem for us because if they pass a barrier or filter, when they get into the warehouse or the manufacturing process, it becomes a food quality problem. So we had to decide between, or make a compromise between health and safety and pest control at 100 lux, and that paid off. I mean, that visibly that's enough for us at the moment.
Okay.
Am I answering your question?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
And at your paragraph, I was going to ask you a question about the port zone, or your comment in paragraph 18 about the port zone, but I think Mr. Chapman's clarified that. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, questions? Yeah, just a couple of questions. So you got. Thank you for your evidence. It's helpful to understand some of the technical components. So you got the resource consent for the rail siding, and how difficult was it to get consent? I mean, was it a notified hearing? Did it go through an appeal process, or was it just simply a non-notified application?
It was a non-notified because we obtained, is that the noise one or the... sorry, I'm confusing between the noise consent and the light consent. I think it was a non-notified process, but again, because I think there were special circumstances there, because of the layout, the rail siding, the water race, which is the paper road, and the rail corridor, the state highway, and then the neighbors across the street, across the state highway. So looking at amenity value for the neighbors, or if it would disturb their sleep, it was considered that it would not. And that's why I probably went non-notified. I was not the processing officer, but I can only summarize. And it went into a non-notified consent. Would that be the same on along Elslington Road or Irvines Road? I doubt it.
Yeah. So again, just focusing on the issue that was raised. So it's the Lux spill onto the adjacent property, and it was part of the issue, the spill onto the railway corridor. It was only the spill onto adjacent privately owned rural properties, or was it the spill onto the road that was considered the issue in that consent issue? And going forward, would it be an issue of the spill onto the rail corridor?
The current rule in the plan basically says that it's at the 3 lux at the official property boundary of the road or somewhere along those lines. So that's why the water race becomes the first boundary, and that's what triggered the consent.
Sure. So I'm just interested in exploring this because the rule, as I read it, says it excludes roads in terms of the impact of
the proposed rule.
Proposed
provisions.
Okay,
sorry, yeah.
we could also exclude rail corridors in terms of future opportunities there, because I can't see why you wouldn't. Would that resolve some of your concerns going forward about expansion or otherwise in that rail siding area if we didn't need to consider Luxville onto the road or the rail corridor or even the paper road, as opposed to changing the Luxville level?
It would, well, development along the rail siding will be more building, there'll be more inland, and building usually don't create that much light. The problem, it will not solve the problem if we want to develop along Eslerton Road and Irvines Road. It's not going to solve that, because there's no rail siding there, there's no corridors. It's a normal rural boundary.
It's an internal boundary, not a road boundary.
Yeah. Well, there's a road boundary.
There's a road boundary. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So for clarity, I'm not sure what the operative plan says, but the proposed plan excludes impact on the roads, as I read it. So, which will give you, I guess, that buffer of the width of the road in terms of your Luxville. But I don't know.
Yeah, it might be that that's subject to another submission from Waka Kotahi. I'm not sure, because I know they've become involved in this process, so we might just need to be cautionary, because they might be opposing that. But,
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, I could add to that. In the Appendix 2 to the Section 42A report, we've actually recommended that roads be included in light REQ1 now.
Okay, thank you.
That was based on recent technical expert evidence from Mr. Mura.
Thank you for clarifying that. Sure. I don't have any further questions.
Okay. No, thank you for that. I'm just trying to, I was just going to ask you a generic question about the history of complaints. And from what you've said, the neighbours are quite remote and they're on the other side of the state highway. But Transit, or rather Waka Kotahi, haven't taken issue with light spill onto the road? Obviously not, because it went non-notified, didn't it? So
no, not that I know of.
No, that's
the orientation is preventing glare, which is probably Waka Kotahi the biggest concern. There are also concerns with spill, but the glare is definitely the top priority, and the way they angled, and because of the landscape. So we have, although they're 14 meters pole, the landscape prevent most of the glare, and that's going to get better with time as the trees grows up. Yeah.
All right. No further questions, but thank you very much for that technical explanation. That's very useful. Thank you.
So just to add to Commissioner Willis's question, I think that what Mr. Denicourt was referring to in the resource consent application, that light probably took a bit of a back seat in that hearing. I mean, with a rail siding, probably noise was the issue that council officers looked at more acutely in terms of that issue of notification for that consent. Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. Perhaps I just go over some of the main points. So my evidence is entirely focused on the policy suite, and in particular the submission of Synlait, which was concerned with the enabling policy, which it picked out as being policy 2. So in my evidence, I do, I guess, start off saying, what is the objective concerned with? And I did find it, I guess, it was unusual to see the word work there, and I don't particularly have any problem with the word work. It's a good one. It covers basically anything almost that you could be doing in life. But I guess what concerns me then is when you go to the policy suite, does that, I guess, help people further understand what the policies are meant to be directing in terms of work when you're thinking about a very large site such as Synlait? And I guess in the end, I became slightly confused by the policies as to which one may be managing effects and which one may be enabling lighting. And so that's probably it in a nutshell, really. And there are I've made some suggestions for an alternative wording to light P2 on page 6 of my evidence, and I'm also aware that Fonterra Den Crystal's evidence makes a suggestion that rather than try and perhaps meddle with a light P2, that there is actually a whole new lighting policy. So there is scope for that as well. I guess the only other comment I probably would make that may or may not be helpful, prior to Synlait undertaking a private plan change request to put in place the DPMA, it relied on the sort of general policy suite in the rural zone. And what happened with one of the last consents, there was something like maybe 18 consents between 2006 and 2014. A lot of the policy in the operative district plan dealt generically with the scale. And, well, I can't remember which particular dryer or application it was, but the council actually recommended decline because they said that the scale of the facility was way beyond what the policy content was. And I guess the lesson learned from that is that really generic policies, which I know you don't want to have a policy for every particular activity, but if the policies don't provide guidance for certain types of activities, it can fall into a bit of a policy hole, which can become difficult at times of consent.
So really, I'll start off just in a nutshell, as I understand your submission or your evidence, LITO 1 is concerned with, in fact, the very first thing it says is enables work before it gets onto the managing effects and health and safety. It talks about enabling work, and yet the only enabling policy is light P2, and that's restricting itself to outdoor lighting of short duration associated with temporary activities and for the purpose of emergency response. And so you're trying to find a way to bring work into a meaningful way, and you think it's necessary to have a specific policy that delivers more on the enabling aspect than what 2 does. Right?
Yes, and I guess work, it's not a common planning term. And so then you rely on the dictionary definition. And basically, if you go to the dictionary, it covers everything that you're sort of applying your mind or physical activity to. And so that could be someone going out to do evening gardening. And then you sort of go, well, how does that compare with what is the policy guidance for a major industrial 24-hour factory? You know, the word work covers both, but what's the policy directive for guiding, I guess, things that fall outside of the accepted thresholds?
Yep, understood. And just in relation to Mr. Crystal's statement, can you just remind me, are you suggesting the same wording as him or something similar? Have you got together?
Well, I guess I've kept within Synlait's the scope of its submission, and so I have suggested some alternative wording to light P2. I'm also aware that Mr. Crystal has suggested that rather than changing P2, there should just be a whole new policy, and I guess from a planning point of view, I consider that to be an acceptable alternative as well.
Questions of Ms. Rikers? Well, I think about one each.
Yeah, I did in terms of, and it was a little along those lines of whether you feel that you're able to, while you support Mr. Crystal's proposed new policy, how that works with, I guess, the relationship with P3, which talks about minimising upward light. And in Mr. Crystal's proposed policy, there's no discussion of minimising it. It just says enable artificial light to support operational needs. There's no discussion of the context of, that could be read to say you can have as much light as you like. and that kind of concerns me. If we were to support that, it would need some tweaking to be consistent with the rest of the policies. I'm just wondering, I know it's a little outside of the scope of your evidence, but if we were to head down that track, would you see some balancing between the enabling of 24-hour operations, but the minimising of, as the rest of the suite seems to indicate, the minimising of light spill and particularly light glare, upwards light glare into our environment?
So, Synlait did, I guess, as part of its submission, make the comment that its facility, it's unable to protect the night sky in the sort of, I guess, most authentic sense. And, with all the best will in the world, you're going to stand beside it. It's going to be an incredibly lit environment. And so, in my view, although the council would probably have regard to all the policies when it's assessing a resource consent, the operational needs are probably going to, I guess, take precedence over protecting a view of the night sky at that point in the district.
Yeah, it's finding the balance. I can understand where you stand immediately next to Synlait or Fonterra or iZone, and you've got an amount of night glare, but it's finding the balance that minimises it so that it doesn't spill. Its spill is minimal, because it's like if you stand in the rural parts of Selma today, you'll see the glare from Christchurch, but it's minimising the spill of that glare to maximise the. That's what I'm just trying to tease out. Sort of, if you stand right next to any of these large operations, it's going to impact on your view of the night sky. But the further you get away from it, the impact should be lessened and the night sky should be more visible.
And I think that provided there's something added to the policy suite around the enabling, the consideration of that will come down to technical evidence as to the design of the lighting. Is it the most efficient? Is it the best that could be done? And have we minimised the spill, balancing the operational and healthy safety needs? So, I'm confident that if something more can be added with the enabling part, that the policy suite will do its job in that sense.
Yes. Just talking about policy 2, have you provided the wording at 26.2?
Yes, that's it.
Thank you.
So thank you for your evidence, Ms. Rikers. So yeah, at 26.2, so just looking at P2, so it's about enabling, I guess originally it was around enabling of specific activities, wasn't it? So temporary activities and emergency activities. And the policy was enabling and the rules were enabling because they didn't have standards. And I just wonder, and I'm asking a question, introducing now the operational needs of activities on a 24-hour basis and enabling those things, do you see a conflict with introducing that in Rule 1? So the policy says enable 24-hour operations, and Rule 1 says actually you need to manage light spill and glare. So does Rule 1 implement the policy, or is it actually a handbrake on it as reworded?
Sorry, Rule 1.
Which Rule 1, which is you need to meet REQ1, REQ2, and REQ3.
So I'm looking at REQ1.
Yeah, and REQ2 and REQ3. So I'm just exploring whether those rules actually give effect to the policy 2 as amended, or whether they actually constrain it. So is the policy consistent with the rules, is my question.
Well, I think you could probably say that about any rule. It's a blunt line, isn't it? That somebody's had to pick a number or a threshold or a setback or whatever and go. And I guess in this case, the evidence, or Mr. Mew is saying that he thinks these rules are sufficiently enabling. You've heard evidence from Mr. Denicourt that there are still outstanding concerns that the rules may not be enabling enough for Synlait. So that's where my evidence is focused on. In the event that there will be potentially another lighting-related consent, does the policy provide sufficient guidance? And I mean, I don't know that I can answer that question wholly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So second question then, is there any conflict between proposed amended policy 2 and policy 1? So policy 1 says manage artificial outdoor lighting to minimise light spill, and amended policy 2 says basically enable it, go for it. Is there any conflict between those two?
I wouldn't have thought so, because a lot of the proposed district plan has an enable section and a manage section.
So if you're a council officer interpreting these policies for a resource consent application, how would you apply policy 1 and amended policy 2?
I think I would probably make give the same answer as I did for Councillor Alexander, that it will come down to the technical information and evidence provided as part of a resource consent, which is going to explain what the lighting need is, what the design is, what the effect of that is, and then council's going to have to make the overall judgment or assessment as to whether the degree of adverse effect is too great or not, having regard to the policy suite.
So just following on then, if we just left P2 as it was, and you've said earlier that in many ways you followed the scope of the submission, but you've said that there are other alternatives such as a new policy, but just exploring the different approaches between policy 1 and amended P2, what if we simply just amended policy 1 to say enable artificial outdoor lighting that is required to provide for nighttime activities whilst managing light spill? Does that not then set up an enablement but manage the effects of within one policy?
Well, that is another option, is that you could look at amending policy 1. I'll just go to it. So you would provide for new artificial lighting, however you want to word it, yes, whilst managing effects on. That is another option.
Because I wonder whether that was the original intent of P1 anyway, because I think in some other evidence I've read they've talked about, I think they worded it quite well. On the face of it, this policy is to provide for enablement and recognition of the purpose of artificial outdoor lighting, but it's framed more in directive terms in terms of minimising adverse effects, and I think that's probably quite an accurate statement for that policy.
I suspect that policy 1 was meant to have an enabling component, but the way, I guess, if multiple people have looked at it and read it in a different way or not, it becomes problematic.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
All right, just one final question, and just in relation to your answer about table 1 and whether it was enabling or not, whether it was in conflict with the policy, it does enable something, doesn't it? It has permitted lux levels that are quite low.
Correct.
But it is enabling to that extent. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Yes.
So it's not saying you can't do something.
No.
Just saying,
correct.
It
is enabling.
Okay.
Good. Just a couple of comments from me, just in relation to questions 2. So, in introduction, I did say that I think that this is about getting the right words, expressing the plan in the right words. So Fonterra's provided one alternative, Ms. Riker's provided another, you've suggested a third. I think Synlait could live with any alternative, provided we get that enabling issue into the policy. And as you've pointed out from the passage that you read out, I think that was the intent. It just hasn't translated down to the words. So we can live with anything provided there's some enabling in there for industry.
Okay, thanks for that. Just on that, I'm interested in the discussion around the policies and whether they need to be discrete. In other words, you have an enabling policy, you have a policy to mitigate, or whether combining them together waters them down somewhat, or, you know, from a legal point of view or from a planning practitioner point of view, is it okay to have discrete policies that are just for enabling, just for mitigation, and then it's up to the decision maker to balance those things? Any comment?
Ms. Rikers might want to comment. You know, if you've got a mixed message in a policy, I, as a lawyer, will exploit it, won't I, when it comes to a hearing? And that may be the issue that you're raising there. Do you have anything to add there, Nicola?
Only, you know, clarity is certainty.
And an observation would be that if you do combine too many things into a policy, you're really lifting up to the objective level. You're going up another step, really, aren't you? And it's not a discrete policy. But, you know, we're open to suggestions on that as to what. But I think you've made your point that the enabling component is not strong enough from your perspective. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. All right. Yeah. And just in relation to Commissioner Alexander's question in relation to the table at REQ1 and in terms of the nighttime level associated with the ports zone, that's at 5 in the table. I think Mr. Delacour's said that on the readings that they had when they were preparing for the rail siding directly on the boundary, it was 6. So I agree with your comment. I don't know how open to interpretation between 5 and 6 is, but in any case, I'll leave that to, I'm not an expert in terms of knowing the answer to that, but
I was seeking to see if the relief that you were seeking was, you know, was something higher than the 5 of the port zone, because you said you wanted to be similar to the port zone, but that doesn't actually give you relief for what you've just said was your actual measurements. If you think that you're close enough and we'll leave it as it stands, that's okay. But if you wanted to come back, Mr. Chair, if they want to come back with a clarification of the relief being sought, could be helpful.
Well, I said in opening that my clarification of the release was to lift it to 10, and that provides what I'll describe as a very decent margin on Synlay's readings that they got for their rail siding. So they're at 6. I'm suggesting a 4 lux margin, if you like. I'm open to suggestions to bring it back right to what is recorded if necessary. But I was simply using that in the context too of demonstrating that the 25 available for the port zone is a country mile of difference in lux levels, even though the operations per se are not that different.
Any questions or clarification from the officer, from the reporting officer? Anything you'd like to raise?
No, I have nothing. I've got a good list of matters to consider in the right of reply.
And I wouldn't rule out the possibility of some sort of collaboration in terms of conferencing, you know, depending on where the panel arrives at, you know, with the sorts of provisions we might be looking for. But we'll certainly await the officer's reply in the first instance anyway. Okay, I think we're pretty well finished for now. So we'll, thanks for coming along. We'll adjourn the hearing and appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much.